Well, thanks.
Sorry.
No worries. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's good morning for me, but I think for most of the folks on the call, or for some of you, it'll be afternoon. But yeah, really wonderful to speak to you today. I'm just a bit more of a description about who I am and where I am. So Sinead Earley, I'm an assistant professor. So still somewhat new here at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George on traditional non-ceded Kwet'lai territory. And I work in the area of environmental policy, writ fairly broadly, but I do apply a social justice and equity lens to that policy work. And really just also to say from the outset that most of my work has been on the forestry sector, so industrial forestry, that's shifted to energy a little bit. So I haven't done a huge amount of work in urban forestry, although some things, and that's what I'll describe today, I think are starting to pull me in that direction. But just to say that, a bit of a disclaimer, I'm certainly would not call myself an urban forest bylaw or tree policy expert, but I'm certainly learning alongside you folks. So as I was alluding to, the thing that has drawn me to the urban tree policy and bylaw stuff has been primarily through my teaching. So UNBC in particular, we're still a relatively small university, and that affords us, I guess, the ability to do, we still have small classes, to do a lot of what I call like service learning or experiential learning. So what I try to do as often as possible is pick up a project. So this comes from developing strong partnerships with community partners, and builds those sort of projects, those service learning projects into my courses. And so what's happened in Prince George, I'd say over the last maybe 2 or 3 years, is that urban tree canopy cover has become, has sort of risen to the fore as an issue in this city. There's a variety of reasons for that. Prince George is currently undergoing pretty rapid development, and that is sort of extensive. So instead of sort of intensive development, we're seeing large losses of tree canopy covered associated with new real estate development. So the city's undergoing this sort of really interesting demographic shift and I'd say residential growth. And alongside with that has come concerns over trying to build tree retention into that urban growth. And so I'd say, there's a lot of interest in terms of residents and community associations, but the city is also pretty tapped in. So over the course of, I think it was last summer, so this is one of the partnerships I'm talking about, well, we reached out to the city, but the city, our program, I'm in environmental sustainability studies. We've been, lucky that we've had a pretty close working partnership with the city for quite some time. So this past summer, we sat down with our city planners, and it's just become quite widely recognized that our urban tree policy in Prince George is ridiculously outdated. So it's dated back to 1994. So we identified a need for update, sort of review and revision, but the city did as well. And so what we ended up doing was my students. So it was 7 students from my introduction to environmental policy class. This is pretty much what we did from September to December, was just do a sort of a deep dive into what the current bylaw stands for, and then a lot of work in terms of what it should stand for. And they actually presented those results to City Council in December in the council chambers. So I can speak to that. I think I can offer some details as to what's happening in Prince George as sort of a case study, and I've got a few slides to kind of cover that if you wish. I'll start with just some sort of general oversights, I guess, kind of there's 3 or 4 kind of key learnings that at least I was able to draw from going through that experience over the last sort of 6 months or so. and maybe some resources I can put in front of you, but I'm not going to speak for too long. I'm hoping that there's some question and answer and just some discussion that can be had. As I said, I'm fairly new to this realm as well, but I think I'll just proceed. Does that sound all right in terms of, yep. Okay. And yeah, please feel free. I'm a back and forth. I don't really like just presenting info to folks. So if you have any questions, yeah, please feel free to raise your hand or even just use the chat. So I'm gonna start by sharing my screen. And yeah, I don't have a great understanding of who the audience is today. I've got a few sort of really general sort of comments, and then I'll sort of dive into the policy specifics. But some of these general comments, I'm sure you folks, this is a special interest for you. So hopefully it's not too repetitious or familiar, but I thought I'd just start with general. Whoops. So you can let me know if you're able to see that. Yeah, okay, just give me one more moment. Okay, so this is just really broad. We're talking about, okay, so why urban tree policy? Why is it so important? I mean, this is what you folks do as a coalition. So as I said, pretty general, but cities. So we are urban. Half of that global 8 billion individuals now live in cities, right? And that's more than 80% of the Canadian population. We live in these urban spaces. And cities, municipalities, this is small to large. I'm going to talk about the differences, significant difference between tree policy in a city like Winnipeg versus a city like Melita, Manitoba or whatnot. Cities are having to deal with really varying capacities in terms of tree protection. But the basic fact is that they're having to come to terms with better situating themselves within or as part of these local ecological systems. And I focus, a lot of my work is on climate change. So this is within that context that there is a lot of unpredictability associated with climate change that cities are having to prepare and adapt themselves for. Private property, I put that in there. So we are working in, we have a sort of a social system in 2023 where there is a sort of preeminence of private property. So in most cities, this is drawing on some literature and some studies, in most cities, 50% of the forest canopy is on private property. And so that's an interesting one because, so Prince George right now, the current bylaw has 0 protection on private property. So that's one. There are some cities that are more aggressive on that. New Westminster, for example, in Vancouver, they regulate private property. So there's some really big varying degrees in terms of that. But I think, you're not really going to get to a comprehensive holistic tree policy or tree bylaw if you're not addressing what happens on private property, right? That's 50% of your canopy cover. And that's easier in some places than others. It's a challenge in Prince George for sure. There are, pretty strong, it matters what your local political context looks like. And then I have that third sphere is public engagement. It really is paramount. And I think the students that did the work this past fall really stressed that through their presentation. I'll touch on that in a few minutes. But that, public engagement allows us for quite a few things, right? It may allow us to uncover inequity issues that prevent some people from, being the best people they can be, right? There's clear studies that show that areas of cities where tree densities are lower, that corresponds with lower income neighborhoods, right? So we have situations where there's heat islands, where you have higher incidence of illness or death associated with heat exhaustion or heart and respiratory issues. Those are happening in areas of the city where there are fewer trees, right? And they're often low-income neighborhoods. But the public engagement piece as well, it just increases general awareness that trees are important, right? what they do for us and what we can do for them. So I'm going to jump into, so this slide is just general. The next few are actually from the presentation that the students gave to City Council last December. But I just thought I'd start with some just big picture kind of overarching insights. The first one is policy mobility. So it's really interesting. You know, I've had a few invitations, such as I had for this meeting today, you know, what tree policies or tree bylaws exist in other places that would work really well for us. And I guess my first answer, or my first suggestion, is to be a bit cautious of that. So we realize that there are some issues with what we call policy mobility. You know, that tree bylaw that works in New Westminster for that specific social and political context is not going to work in Prince George. we're still very much kind of a blue collar, resource extraction oriented town, although that's changing. We do have a really big service sector, or a really big, the service sector is huge, right? The university as well as the hospitals. But that, you know, we've been dealing with this in Prince George and Northern British Columbia for a really long time, that there's often these policies that are developed in metropolitan centers. And because we have lower capacity in the north or in smaller cities, we don't have the city staff to update and develop these policies. There's often these transplants, right? They're just like, why don't you try this bylaw here or a bylaw like this here? And that just historically we're finding in Prince George doesn't work, right? So there's a lot of issues with that. So that's why I don't actually have, you know, I'm not spending most of my time today saying, here's some examples of good. I'll put forward some good elements of what a tree bylaw might look like and some restrictive ones, but just to keep in mind the restrictions of those policy mobility that happens across public policy spheres, right? You know, we've experienced that over and over again, particularly coming from the metropolitan Vancouver area. You know, some of those policies often push north. They tried and they fail in our particular social and ecological contexts. Of course, what that means is that it requires work. It requires us and our mayors and our city councilors and our city staff to do a lot of work in terms of what will fit our community. Urban forests as green infrastructure. You might have started to hear that phrase a bit more. Green infrastructure. You've probably heard ecosystem services. You know, these are just different ways of thinking about how we can value biological and ecological systems, right? And so some cities are starting to take this route. And the idea is that we have to start putting these forests on the same docket as road systems, sewage systems, energy systems. The services that intact forests already provide us are huge. And if cities are able to recognize those services, it will actually save them money, right? So we've got urban cooling. They're actually, you know, there are natural sort of cooling systems. Stormwater retention or stormwater control is pretty huge in Prince George. We've got two huge rivers running through our city, and some steep embankments, right? So our root systems and that sort of mycorrhizae system offer huge value in terms of dealing with these very unpredictable and pretty scary storms that are starting to hit us that are associated with climate change. Soil erosion control, just so many aspects of, so I was just doing some searches this morning. Some cities are taking this route in terms of updating their tree bylaws, and, you know, classifying these spaces and these abilities to do these services for human communities as green infrastructure. So that's pretty interesting. Inventories. So some of you might live in towns or cities where the tree canopy is well documented, and some might live, you know, where we don't have that data yet. We certainly live in an era where digital representations are really the building block of policy. I guess just taking this approach that if we are arguing to protect, we need to document what we want to protect. Tree inventories is often a first step, I guess, for a lot of communities if they don't have a good one yet. And those can be done in different ways too, right? So a city like, the size of Prince George, we've got 80,000, 85,000 people. We've got a fairly large staff on city staff. We do have a GIS department, right? And we've got a few dedicated staff and individuals. So you could take that GIS route. There's also a lot of really interesting examples of citizen science in terms of, especially when we're talking about private property. Because those GIS or those remote sensing sort of technologies can give you a pretty good sort of general from the air sense, but there are a lot of aspects of tree growth, tree species, very specific elements like that, someone actually documenting the trees in their own backyard and then putting that on a full community database actually gives us a higher resolution of data and a higher set of knowledge or data sets for us to work with. So there's actually, at the end of this conversation, I can put forward some examples in Canada where there's some really interesting sort of citizen science tree inventory projects happening. And some of you might be involved in some as well, but that's a different approach. So and especially for smaller cities or smaller towns or villages that don't necessarily have that elected representative or municipal sort of capacity. There's different ways of going about inventory work. And the last big point I'll make is partners and allies. So I think, why we have momentum here in Prince George right now is because and it takes time, it takes trust and relationship building. There's a few counselors that are starting to grab hold of this. And I think that's really important. So if you're able to, if there are some elected representatives that you're able to kind of, even if they have just like a little flicker of green in their eye, right, to develop those partnerships and relationships can actually really help. So what we've seen is that, one counselor has really helped to carry this forward. And the same goes for city staff, for mayor. So if there's any sort of, and then same with other community, you're a coalition yourself, but if there's other, jumping on board with other community groups. So what's helped us here in Prince George, community group, there's a group called Ginter's Green Forever that has just evolved over sort of disputes over some residential or some contractor and builder development, Conservation North, Conservation Group, etc. And then the last thing I'll note is, and how I became involved, it's absolutely astounding how much work and how much information was gathered by the students. So this was an identified need by city staff. They said, okay, this is ridiculous. We need to update our tree bylaw. They, hooked up with me, one other professor in our program, and then we got a student group to work on this stuff. So maybe think about schools, think about universities in your region. You could, if there's a lot of work to be done, there might be some potential in terms of these sort of university or college community partnerships that can really pick up a project like this and get it going. So that's all I have to say in terms of big general overview. I already feel as though I'm talking a bit too much. So I'm going to, and I don't know where we are for time. I'm going to just, I'm probably not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to go through a few elements of what the students came up with when we went about doing this work in terms of updating Prince George's bylaw. So one thing to note too, in British Columbia, our municipal policy might look a little bit different than those in Saskatchewan or Manitoba, but municipalities are required to have an official community plan. So that's the OCP, and that's required to be updated every 10 to 15 years. So I'm sure you have an equivalent in your jurisdictions. So this is one thing that we really honed in on. So the OCP is up for review this year, so 23. And so we, some people think that it's a sort of flimsy piece of paper, the OCP. Some people think that it is an opportunity for heightened community engagement, et cetera. There's very different opinions as to its impact. But we sort of timed this. So now the presentation to council was in December. And the motion that was passed, we didn't get anything with like a huge amount of teeth in terms of them diving into a bylaw update right away. But it is required now that they are going to update the bylaw as part of the OCP review. So that's required of them, right? So by the time 2023 is out. So we kind of rolled it into that package. So there's a way of thinking about how to sort of roll bylaw updates into wider policy processes too. So yeah, these are just some of the key points the students wanted to put forward, wider levels of public input. The youth perspective is really interesting, right? So, you know, we have an interesting, you know, if you're talking about sort of political spectrum, left to right, you know, Prince George still sits quite solidly in the right side of that political spectrum. We have for the last 30 years or so. And so it's, especially when it comes to regulating private property, there is a lot of opposition and pushback there. So what we try to figure out, you know, what values are really important to folks that live in this city. Family values are really important. Youth values are really important. And even in terms of the growing city, this sort of attraction of young folks and establishing new families in this place, which is what's happening. We're having a lot of this demographic shift I'm talking about. We actually have a lot of people and families moving up from the Vancouver area because the cost of living is just too high and they're arriving in Prince George. And so we are recognizing too that this younger generation, or your 20 or 30 something, they value nature. So Prince George, the city is starting to recognize this, and that can be a bit of a turning point in terms of what is it that we protect in this city. And so there is a wider and sort of growing interest in sort of holding up this youth perspective, and trying to align city planning to attract these young minds and for them to stay in this city. So hopefully this isn't too out of context. These were just these next two slides are just kind of some of the key points that the students wanted to make. So this, I guess, shows you one slide that I just deleted was just a sort of a review of the existing bylaw. It pretty much is a tree cutting bylaw. It's not a tree protection bylaw. So pretty much everything in there is just regulating, what can get cut and how it gets cut. There's no tree replacement policy. So that's what the students started with, was that we have to revise our language hugely. We need to go about developing a tree protection bylaw. Because this is where we're at in Prince George. The only existing protected area is what's called the AG Greenbelt and select riparian zones. So not even all our streams and rivers, well, the major rivers are, but not even all our streams and waterways are protected within city limits. So they're pushing for, all riparian zones to be covered under the tree protection bylaw. And they are in not so strong language. They're talking about this as applying to all zones across the city of Prince George. So this would include private property. I thought I'd keep this one in, tree replacement, retention, and care. There's a lot of tree planting programs all over the country, all over the world. And I, again, take a cautious approach to those. We've seen a lot of those, hundreds of thousands of dollars go into those tree planting programs. They're not, in terms of where those trees are planted and why, are not necessarily done with the expertise of arborists or registered professional biologists or people that know about the biological sort of needs of trees. So you see hundreds of thousands of dollars go down the drain in some of these tree planting projects because the care and retention piece isn't part of the plan, right? So there's actually a huge amount of, some of the stronger tree bylaws in Canada have strong language in terms of retention and care. So the students kind of zoned in on that. Some city, Prince George doesn't even have an arborist on staff. I mean, most large cities of this size do. But that's a pretty, you can have that written into a bylaw that there has to be a registered professional that is on staff that's able to manage the urban canopy. So that's I think it's important, that retention and care piece, and you can build that into your bylaws. This is the last one here. This is a bit more, this is just kind of the urban livability. This is just in terms of, maybe I won't go over this too much, but just, I guess, this general recognition that human health is contingent upon the health of our green space, or human health can be greatly improved, right? If we recognize the if we recognize the value of urban forests to physical health as well as mental health. Whoops, sorry. So I think I'll leave it at that. I think I'm going to open it up to, oops, just wait a second. Some comments or questions. I will also say that I do have, so the students did put forward a 25-page report. I do have the executive summary here that has the more specific recommendations that we put forward to City Council in December. So if we have time, I could kind of get into those, but I think maybe it might be more valuable to have a discussion at this point. So I'll just open up the floor.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Earley. Yeah, so if you have a question, please raise your hand using the Zoom function or place it in the chat. So Linda, start with you, your question. Oh, you're muted.
I just want to say it's Arbor Week this week in Saskatoon. So we've got all kinds of events happening. So this was good timing to have this conversation. And we had a U of S webinar last night. The speaker was Tenley Conway from the University of Toronto. And she said a lot of the same things that you just spoke about, even though she was talking about the bigger cities. They did a study in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, and I kind of wish she would have their study would have included a few smaller cities to see the difference. It was more about attitudes of how people felt about their urban forest and how they could improve the way people think, but they didn't include any of the smaller cities like ours or Prince George even. But yes, it seems like everybody's kind of talking about the same thing and about the importance of protection. And she talked about how 50% is on private property. And that's, I don't know how the attitude in Saskatoon is kind of the same as Prince George, in that there's no way, like we're in the process right now of getting a tree bylaw, and we don't have a bylaw, we have a policy, which doesn't really stand up in court when necessarily. So they are in the process. I think it's just being reviewed right now by lawyers, which is great. And they invited us to have say in it, and we were included in some meetings. But of course, they also had other people involved, like the developers, who had a whole different idea of how they wanted to see the bylaw go. So I think some of our ideas did get watered down a bit. But I did mention, can there not be something in there about private? They didn't even want to go there because they thought it would, and it probably would, slow down this first bylaw. So having a private bylaw, it seems like it's a long ways away. So how else can we protect those private trees? What are some ideas that we can use to get out there to the community or the general public, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard one. I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I think there's a few strategies, I guess. One of the things we talked about a lot with city staff was caveats for new development. So, that is going to be the future private property. So sure, the barriers might be a bit too high in terms of getting people that already have their feet, very firmly dug in the ground in their own homes. That they, but in terms of having some what were some of the pathways we were talking about? But just in terms of retention, so like not allowing for clear cut or just certain requirements for retention into new development, such as you can go the fine pathway where if they don't, keep a certain percentage of trees on new development, that they'll have a cost. But we'll also know that a lot of developers just put this into their budget of the cost of doing business. So there could be a way of incentivizing new developers to keep trees as they build new places. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I think that's pretty important, right? Like, even I do a lot of carbon management and carbon accounting stuff, and we're talking a lot about embodied carbon, which is actually the carbon that is released during the new construction, right? We're realizing that sure, there's a lot of work to do in terms of retrofitting and sort of redoing what we've already done in terms of our built environment. But we also, like, if we just start doing things differently with the new stuff we're building, it might be huge. So yeah, maybe there might be, it's hard, right? I mean, it's trying to design a bylaw that will be advantageous for developers as well as for trees, right? That's the hard part. I'm trying to recall the conversation I had with our city staffer on this, but there might be some incentives that can be built in, whether there's like permit reward programs for developers that develop a certain track record. And then the other piece I think is having to get private property owners on board, which I think we've identified as a bigger barrier. It's a sort of higher hurdle to get over, and I think the education front and is probably it's the way to go on that. It's just, how can we, what sort of information do we need to put in front of property owners to help them realize the common value of the tree canopy cover. So yeah, those are two. Yeah, I don't have a very good answer for you, but we're in the same situation in Prince George, where we most likely will not see that private property, that extension into that zone in this next round of bylaw. Just as you said, it'll probably get caught up and it'll slow it down too much. So there is incremental change, I guess, is a way to think about some things. But and then I guess I would encourage you to go to, because as you say, some of these big metropolitan centers, they just have different values, right? So, but there are, some of those bylaws you can look at that, and they regulate trees on private property. If you cut something down over 6 feet, you have to replace it. Sometimes some of them have a 2-to-1 replacement policy. Some of them have a 3-to-1 replacement policy. And so those do exist in some places, so it's doable. So I guess I would say, look at some of those policies in terms of understanding that, like, it's not as if it's a completely sort of outer space question. I mean, it's really fascinating. My partner is an arborist, and he worked in Vancouver for 15 years, and he's been in Prince George now for 6 or 7. So it's been really fascinating, from a working perspective. He's moved radically different policy contexts, but he still thinks, he thinks it's doable in terms of it requires even a transformation of the arboriculture sector. You're going to have to, if you're regulating private property, you have to get a whole permitting process set up, and then you have to have those tree companies or those arbor companies on board in terms of working with that permitting process as well.
Yeah, I did mention when we were going over what should be in the bylaw. I read somewhere, I think it might have been Ottawa's bylaw. They've got a really good one. But I think they couldn't push the private one very far, but they did include, and I can't remember the name of the term they used. It was something like, it wasn't heritage tree, it was maybe special something tree. If they were a certain size and approximate age, they had to be protected even on private property. And I can't remember the term. They had a special term they used for it. So they did stick that in. So some trees on private property were protected through this, but I'd have to go back and look at how they did it. But I did mention that for ours, and they didn't even want to put that in there because they felt it would slow it down. So anyway,
Yeah.
slowly.
Yeah, I mean, it's the lobby groups too that are, so I mean, in some ways it's exposure of whose pockets are in whose hands are in whose pockets, which is a huge challenge. In Prince George in particular, it is often this, it's often the green NGOs against the developers, but we have to try and break down that dichotomy somehow. And I think policy is one avenue. If we can be creative in terms of how we design our bylaws that are somehow advantageous to both those groups. So yeah, actually it makes me think, I think we need to do a lot more work on the new development piece, right? So what do we need new contractors to do? It's got to be, I don't know, from my perspective, if I were buying a new place, I'd want trees beside it. But anyways, to make it appealing to consumers, right? So we just have to make that pitch somehow, and we need to represent it through bylaw. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Shirley, go ahead. Oh, I think you're muted.
It's not. Am I unmuted now? I think so.
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm from Winnipeg, and we do not have a tree bylaw. We can't agree. Obviously, we've had a lot of discussions on the various ways that we can maybe get a tree bylaw for private property. My background is I worked as a planner for the province of Manitoba, and master's. I'm a nurse and in urban planning, so I've been reading plans, obviously, and even our Winnipeg strategy, they use the term green approach. And if you look at the plans across Canada, and this is coming at it sideways. In Winnipeg, what they're doing is they're granting huge variances, sometimes up to 0 feet, and then building really large buildings. So they will never be a tree for the foreseeable future, probably next 40 years on that property. But in some of the urban plans, they're using what they call a green approach, which means they have to have 2.5 meters between, as a setback, allowing for trees to be built. So they're not saying tree, but they're actually, because of the setbacks, they won't be necessary to cut down the trees, which is happening in Winnipeg. They cut the trees down right away. They clear cut the lots. Now they're using the term green approach in Winnipeg strategy, which is currently good, but they're not defining it. So the definition is really critical. Now, a lot of this I took out, and it did win awards for best plan for Vaughan, Ontario, which uses a green approach. I don't know how many of you have read that. But the diagrams I have, I took from their first draft of their report, urban planning, and that's what has been used. So you're not talking about tree bylaw, which gets people's like right up, they get upset. But if we could get them to talk about a green approach, which politicians right now like to talk about, they're signing a agreement, which they may have any intention actually honoring it. But if they can get a green approach and they can get a definition that there has to be at least a 2.5 foot setback so they can put in canopy trees to provide shade, for all the benefits that you get with shade trees. I don't know if any of you have discussed that at all. Or anyway, I've done a whole slide, just did a presentation on it to City Council, which I wouldn't bore any of you with. But if anyone is interested, they can always contact me, because we have we're the only place in Canada that has such, I would say, restrictive setback variance bylaws. In Winnipeg, and I think the sentence is, we can't do anything that is injurious to the applicant's property, which is usually the developer.
Yeah.
Like other problems, like BC has, there's something about health and wellness or the natural environment. We don't have that in Manitoba. It's all about the developer and protecting their investment. But if we can get this policy with a definition of the green approach, which we've taken from other jurisdictions, hopefully we can at least not have any more ever 0-foot setbacks to prevent people from getting down to the riverbank, which is what occurred in my area, the city. Which is anyway, that's just my thoughts on what we're working on here.
Yeah, no, it's really great. Actually, Trees Please was one of the sort of groups that I had the students that we came across when we were doing our research. They looked at what you were doing in Winnipeg for sure. And yeah, it's really interesting. There are hard and soft law approaches, right? So you can go because a bylaw is if we're looking at a piece of policy that can be enforceable by law. But I think what you're pointing to, Shirley, is that there are a lot of really powerful, more softer laws that some cities are pursuing. And I think, looking to some of the other smaller, Winnipeg's a big city, but, our conversation earlier about city size or whatnot, my students, and the Vaughan, Ontario example is really a really interesting one to look at. Kamloops has also done, so we were trying to look at other small or medium-sized cities. We're also trying to look at northern cities, but Kamloops, these aren't northern cities, but Kamloops and then Gibson's on the Sunshine Coast, those are also pretty interesting places that you might want to dig into in terms of their approach. Because Kamloops took that sort of softer approach, right? This sort of commitment, signatories and commitment, and that can carry a green approach a long ways, right? So there are different avenues, and in some ways you need like a multi-pronged approach in some of these places, right? You might get incremental stuff put in terms of a hard bylaw, but in terms of that transformative change and that educational change in terms of bringing the wider populace on board, some of those softer sort of approaches can be really effective, right? Because I think I saw Winnipeg had an urban, was it a few days ago I read that they did have a fairly new urban tree plan.
Yeah, but it doesn't touch on private property.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and most of and particularly I live in this older part of the city, most of the trees, well, until recently, because they're getting cut down rapidly, were located on, private lots.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But have you seen, that was my question, there's the Vaughan definition for green approach. Have you seen a good definition for green approach anywhere that you would recommend people read?
I think I'm just trying. We moved through so many sources last. I think Kamloops had a pretty good one, but this was an interesting one because the definition. You're touching on a really important part, and because you have to define your terms quite clearly. I think maybe the Kamloops one. So I'll take a look maybe after this meeting, and but otherwise, yeah, I don't know exactly where I'd point you to in terms of that green approach. There's just so many different there's semantics around all of this, right? I think the green approach is being taken in a lot of places, perhaps just using a bit different wording, but and then I did put a link in the chat, so to our program website. And yeah, I think up at the top under student achievements, we do have the full reports are there. So you should be able to find them there. The executive summary should be on the first page or two. It's interesting. Another one of my colleagues was teaching a different course at the same time just called Environmental Perspectives. And so they actually did another report called The Value of Nature, which is a bit more, it was just about green space more broadly, whereas ours was really focused on the tree bylaw. So those might be interesting for you. I think they might have some examples from other places in that report as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Julia?
Hi there. Thank you. Your report was wonderful. I'm glad that there's many initiatives being undertaken by everybody here. It's interesting that the students decided on a 2-to-1 tree replacement instead of a 3-to-1. And I see that your dilemma in Prince George is quite different than our dilemma in Saskatoon on the prairies, because when we saw the aerial view of Prince George being surrounded by an arboreal forest, whereas we're surrounded by prairie. So most of our trees are planted, whereas most of your trees are native. So to me, it's much more important for your developers, your long-range planners, to have something implemented in their tree bylaw so that developers are mandated to keep a certain percentage of trees on the lot. I know that that's hard when people are grandfathered into a private tree bylaw, but when development goes out where that should be, because I know in the city of Saskatoon, long-range planners pick the developers in our various sector plans because of what they promise to the city. One developer might say, pick me, long-range developers, and I'll put in all your light standards. Another one might say, pick me, and I'll put in a park of this size and maintain it for 10 years. So what you guys need to do from an NGO type status or a university education status perhaps is to say to the developers, the city has to say to the developers, we will pick you as a developer if you keep this percentage of trees, and also for the city to advertise that so that when the residents start to grow into that neighborhood, even though there is pushback against private bylaws, if there's advertising that it's being marketed as a green space, then more than likely the residents will be kind of like a Jane Jacobs thing, and they'll be eyes on the street, and they'll want to promote that more in their own neighborhood. So education and community development is really, really important. And next time your official community plan is made, you have to be right on the ground floor and be part of that. It's really, really awkward, like you said earlier, that the developers do. They're the ones that grease the wheels of the city sometimes with the money, and NGOs just don't have the money to grease the wheel. So it's kind of like Monsanto always selling glyphosates, and all the green groups not being able to say organic farming might be a better alternative for lots of reasons. But yeah, I like that green approach being advocated. So yeah, where we have to plant trees, you have to protect trees. So that's a really important thing. So thank you for all the work you did. And I'm glad you have students coming forward, because the next generation is what's going to change what goes on and what happens. So schools are really, really vital in this.
Yeah. Well, it's really important if you're thinking about, public speaking or even working with city councils or whatnot, like I was pretty floored. So the youth voice at that city council, like it's strong, and the counselors are really lit. Like I didn't speak at all. I didn't even introduce the groups. The students did it all themselves. And that actually was pretty powerful in and of itself. So I think, if we can get younger groups on board, we also have the Fraser Basin Council that does a lot of watershed management stuff. They've got a youth council going on. I think we're seeing a surge of like strong voices coming from that youth perspective that hopefully city councils are starting to listen to a little more strongly. But yeah, I think you point to that exact fact that our bylaws and our programs and plans are going to look different depending on socio-ecological context, right? You're going to have more about afforestation, and we have to work hard for retention in new development. So, because you're right, and this is why I've in some of my other research, I've Prince George is a tree cutting culture. That surfaces over and over again. But it's also a culture that sure, our livelihoods and jobs have been so closely tied to the forestry sector and the use of wood and trees. But we are closely connected to those trees. Like there's a deep connection that comes through that sort of livelihood employment tie, right? If we can just sort of harness that connection to trees in a different sort of way, then, you know, I think it's there. I think that's sort of, yeah, it's, you know, tree cutting culture, but also we're, you know, a lot of people have the perspective that, you know, we're surrounded by trees. We've got so much, we've got a lot of green space in the city. What does it matter, right? Yeah, it's, there's almost this sort of myth of overabundance that, I mean, it permeates our industrial sector as well, that we just kind of keep moving forward because we think we have this sort of endless supply, which is actually not the case.
That is scary because we've seen that happen with the passenger pigeon and the bison across the North America, and overabundance doesn't last long. Is there any way to get First Nations and Indigenous people on board because they have a connection with the land and they have been advocates for other things?
Yeah.
Park spaces.
Yeah, well, this was, yeah, I mean, it's, the students wanted to work with the Lheidli T'enneh on this and see if they have any sort of policy or guidance in their governance documents on trees in their traditional territory. We haven't done that. That might be a sort of next step. One of the things that the students did pitch, though, was the accessibility piece, that a bylaw should be written so that you've all been spending time researching and digging into bylaws. They're like, it's almost like a different language. These bylaws need to be written so that they're accessible to a wide variety of cultural groups, so that, you know, so that they can have more impact. Or if they're unacceptable, you know, the general population, a culturally diverse population, can sort of respond to what that bylaw does not do for them. So we are even talking about like accessibility in terms of language and linguistic diversity. But I think that's, you know, an important piece when we're talking about rewriting bylaws. Who are they for? They're usually for lawyers and politicians and planners, which some would argue that no, bylaws are supposed to be for community. So there's an accessibility piece there, or even in terms of translation. Sure, if we have these sort of clinically written bylaws, there should be a frontward facing piece that is more widely accessible to the full and diverse population, right?
Totally. And those reports should not be in PDF format, because PDF format precludes them from anybody using a screen reader who might want to be in touch. I was really impressed with the city of Saskatoon getting a grant for their natural capital asset valuation plan, because it did put a value on green spaces where green spaces never used to have a dollar value, only Grayscape did. So I thought that was a really positive step forward for Saskatoon, but still our NCAV is not nearly as competitive as our library and our police station. They got the sizable chunk of the budget, and our green space got next to nothing. If you look at the percentage of where the budget went where, and right now our city's locked into 2-year budgets at a time, so that's extremely frustrating. Do you guys have a 2-year or a 1-year budget there?
2-year, pretty sure.
Yeah. Right.
I know, they just took some money out of the snow removal budget and everyone was up in arms. But yeah, no, all really, really interesting points. And yeah, it sounds like you're all doing really, really great work.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Earley.